One of the most popular shows on Netflix these last 2 weeks has been Trust Me, The False Prophet, a documentary series that follows the riveting tale of a break-off sect from the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It tells the truly disturbing story about Samuel Bateman, who claimed to be a successor to Warren Jeffs after Jeffs had been sentenced to prison. Though the group was only a few dozen members, it featured plenty of trauma, including a number of child brides and child sexual abuse. So please, if you watch this video, and especially if you watch the Netflix series, just know going in, it covers some truly disgusting material, and so be prepared for that. This is just the most recent of many media depictions about Mormon fundamentalism in American culture. It remains a fascination for the United States general public. It also remains a thorn in the side of the LDS Church. This particular story is interesting because it focuses on one small sliver of the wider fundamentalist sphere. So it raises the questions, what lessons can we draw from this particular episode? And perhaps more importantly, what ethics or what are the ethics in place when trying to engage a story as disturbing as this one? I hope to tackle these questions in 2 videos. This will be the first, and I'll do the second next week. In this video, I'll provide some background to the American fascination with Mormon fundamentalism. I'll introduce some of the key issues and plot lines, though I'll try to keep it a bit spoiler-free on this new documentary. And then I'm going to interview the scholar of Mormon fundamentalism, Dr. Christina Galliano, who has written an award-winning book on one of the fundamentalist prophets. And then I'll conclude with some of my own thoughts on the show. So please note that this is just part 1 of a series on this documentary and Mormon fundamentalism. Next Wednesday, I will do an interview with Shirley Draper, a member of the Short Creek community, a former member of the fundamentalist group who is now doing really important support work for that group and that community in southern Utah and northern Arizona. And then in 2 weeks, for my monthly live discussion on Wednesday, May 6th, I will be doing an interview with Lindsay Hansen Park, one of the foremost public scholars on Mormonism, Mormon fundamentalism, and including media depictions, given her work on TV shows and documentaries in the past. So all that should be, I hope, an important conversation, so let's dig in. If you were to look at the bestseller list for books on Mormonism on Amazon on any given week, you will see it often dominated by books about Mormon fundamentalism. Perhaps the most read book on Mormonism in the last 20 years has been John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven. There are also a slew of very moving and powerful memoirs from women who have escaped polygamy, and all this is building on the television fascination with Mormon fundamentalists, going from HBO's Big Love in the early 2000s to TLC's Sister Wives to the many spin-offs in more recent years. Mormon fundamentalism piques the cultural interest. It seems so countercultural, a historical remnant of a past age, and it also fits into general skepticism of religion and seeing this extreme patriarchal, tyrannical in some ways, and harmful religion that fits the anti-institutional mythos of modern-day America. It also fits into modern America's fascination, at least in the last decade, with true crime documentaries. The peak in the last few years that use Mormonism as a titillating story of religious violence and crime. In 2021 to 2022 alone, there were 2 documentaries titled Keep Sweet about Mormon fundamentalists. One on the Discovery Channel that focused on the Short Creek community in the last 2 decades, and the other, the multi-episode docu-series on Netflix that offered a longer historical context for Mormon fundamentalism. Now, Mormon fundamentalism itself has a fascinating story, and I have done a previous video on the Short Creek community, so please go check that out if you haven't. But in brief, Mormon fundamentalism organized as a coherent movement rather than a dissenting culture in the 1930s, And then it quickly splintered into a variety of different sects and churches and community and congregations and denominations that all trace their origins back to originally that fundamentalist sect and the Woolies in the 1930s, and then of course further back to John Taylor and Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. Yet many of the most famous aspects of Mormon fundamentalism, the isolationism, the pioneer dresses, and so forth, are actually much more of a modern creation than you'd think. The Netflix series on Keep Sweet actually does a really good job of showing this turn, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, to trying to reject modernity and doing things like in their dress and their demeanor and their words, acting more like this remnant of the past. But again, that's a topic for another video. What I think is important before I dig into this particular documentary is to note some of the common media myths that come out of these treatments of Mormon fundamentalism. On the one hand, fundamentalism is often treated as a historic heirloom rather than a modern invention. Even the term fundamentalism typically seems to imply that they're going back to lost fundamentals, when in reality, their movements, like any other religious group, is modern-day creations responding to modern-day anxieties, which means you have to know the history to place the movement in context, something that's often lost. Second, fundamentalists are often presented as a stark distinction between the civilized world and the irrational, even using the words like cult, a term that I know means a lot to those within those communities, yet scholars feel increasingly uncomfortable for a variety of academic reasons that maybe I'll get into another video. Even the scenic red rocks of southern Utah that are often a key character in these stories represent that we are entering a different world from civilized society. And third, there's a common myth of a lack of evolution in fundamentalism, acting as if Mormon fundamentalists have retained this idea going all the way back to the 1930s or even further back, that Warren Jeffs is just a modern version of what Mormon prophets were in the past, where in reality, Mormon fundamentalism, just like any religion, has gone through massive evolution over time. And to reduce that to the simplistic continuity idea really does a disservice to history. So in other words, fundamentalists in modern media are allowed to be part of the American story so long as they are just seen as a historic exhibit of whatever values you want to place, like tyranny and child sexual abuse and patriarchy and so forth. And I think this depiction of Samuel Bateman and what they called the Samuelites, the focus of the Trust Me documentary, fit into a lot of those stereotypes quite easily. Before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content that tries to provide perspective to our current moment, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I try to do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present every Wednesday, including considering religion in media productions like this documentary. And then on Friday, I pull back the curtain on the historian's craft, either talking about new books, interviewing authors, or digging into the sources behind historiographical arguments so that you too can become an expert on these topics. And if you want to give back to this channel, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, you can become a member, where for a very, very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you comment, and most importantly, you can feel good that you are supporting a public-facing scholarly production of history, making the time that I and my producer, Anthony, spend on this channel worthwhile. I also recommend subscribing to my free kit newsletter, the link to which you will find in the video description. I send out these newsletter blasts every other week or so that have links to a variety of videos, essays, updates, events to keep you informed on all the nerdy things that are going on. You can also follow me on various social media platforms where I do supplemental videos and highlight exciting new work taking place. And mark your calendar for my next live video, which will be taking place on this channel on Wednesday, May 6th, and I will be talking with Lindsay Hansen Park, a wonderful expert not just on Mormon fundamentalism, but on Mormonism and the media, and it should be a great discussion. All right, but let's get back to the Trust Me documentary. The documentary Trust Me, The False Prophet begins with Christine Marie Katas, the hero of the story, being directed by her husband, Tolga, being posed for a scenic image. And that really sets the tone for the framework of this film. It's more to emphasize how much of this documentary is framed around production and staging, and Christine being the key character. She is not a Mormon fundamentalist, so she has her own unique background that I'll get into in a bit. She is the hero going in, embedding herself in the life, and eventually helping all those women and children to be saved. You even see this in the poster for the documentary, where she is facing the opposite direction of everyone else, wearing her pink boots. She is the one standing out, and in the first few minutes of the documentary, she even curses on film, which is a sign to all of us that she can be trusted. She is distinct. This framing of her, the outsider, embedding herself and eventually being the hero, is both in some ways the strength of the show and what allows them to get the access they do, but it also makes me a bit uncomfortable, which I'm going to get into in a bit. So the story is, in the wake of Warren Jeffs going to jail for child sexual abuse a number of years ago, and he will never see the light of day outside the jail, thankfully, Samuel Bateman took advantage of the vacuum that was left behind. Jeffs had declared that no marriages are going to take place, while he could not enter more marriages. Now, before this point, Samuel Bateman was largely a nobody in the community, and yet he eventually convinces several men that he is Warren Jeffs' successor, and then those men give to him their wives and children, making him the new prophetic figure within what soon some people are calling the Samuelites. Now, he is not a very charismatic and impressive figure. He's probably even a bit slow if you watch some of the matters. Some of his statements and goals are just simply absurd. Yet his success, as Dr. Galliano is going to be saying in an interview in a bit, shows the degree to which Warren Jeffs had already groomed and manipulated that congregation, that community, and the vacuum that was left when he was gone, that Samuel Bateman was able to take advantage. So the degree to which Samuel Bateman has success in his nefarious activities are a testament to how much Warren Jeffs had already groomed those individuals for that kind of takeover. Now, on the one hand, this is a very small group, only a few dozen members, yet on the other hand, they are still humans. This is a human story, and their story is still worthwhile. And further, the tensions found within this admittedly quixotic, disturbing group can be replicated or reflective of much larger tensions in Mormon fundamentalism in particular, as well as Mormonism in general, the nature of priesthood authority, the construction of us versus them mentality, and also the pitfalls of patriarchal control. And then there's Christine Katas, who, with her husband Tolga, is a key figure here. They choose to move to Short Creek to help out that community, and they framed themselves as this heroic sacrifice. One of the quotes early on is, "We gave up a life of comfort for a life among the polygamous." Now, Christine has a complicated background of her own that's hinted to toward the end of episode 2, where she fell prey to a false Mormon prophet who ends up trafficking her to homeless communities as part of a crazy psycho experiment thing that is actually covered a bit more in the Keep Sweet documentary, or not the Discovery documentary Keep Sweet. And then so she has some background understanding that community. It's also important to note that these fundamentalist places are very complicated spaces where lots of people come in with different dynamics, different agendas, especially when film crews come in and try to film these groups. There are stories of people coming in with their cameras and asking the fundamentalist women and girls to put on their pioneer dresses that they don't usually wear, because they are being staged for a type of cultural production. Now, I don't know if that is taking place here, but I think that backdrop is important to understand the way that fundamentalists live and the way that they are sometimes staged. Eventually, Christine is able to get the trust of Samuel Bateman and his family, which is what enables her to get truly disturbing footage, including him admitting on tape to abusing and sexually assaulting these minority girls. In fact, at one point, the truly chilling statement that, quote, "there is no such thing as underage girls in the priesthood." Samuel Bateman is a monster, and what they did was justified in putting him in jail. The story then follows Christine's attempt to gather enough evidence for Bateman to be convicted and thrown in jail, which places Christine in a moral conundrum, at one point saying, quote, "I knew that if I were to help them, notably the young girls, I would have to betray them." And the strength of this series is in the sheer amount of documentary footage and several of the key figures that come to the foreground, most notably Julia, one of the older mothers who is both married to Bateman, as well as sees some of her children married to Bateman, and eventually realizes the problems and starts working with Christine. And then perhaps more powerfully to me is Noms, one of the young, she's not underage, but she is quite young, women married to Bateman, and eventually comes around and recognizes the problems. I'll also note that, as Dr. Galliano says in the interview, there are questions of the use of minors in this documentary series, especially the issue of digitally altering minor faces. This goes beyond my level of expertise, and it's of course something that I don't have, the stakes in, but I want to acknowledge those problems and issues that have been raised from the community itself that we do need to keep in mind when discussing this production. There are few scholars in recent years who have done more to learn about the fundamentalist community as well as work within the fundamentalist community as Dr. Christina Galliano, who is an independent scholar and award-winning historian. She received her PhD in religious studies from University of California at Riverside and previously taught at Utah Tech University. Her book, Joseph Musser, A Mormon Fundamentalist, won the Best Biography Prize from the Mormon History Association. I am very grateful that Dr. Galliano agreed to join me to talk about this documentary, and especially to put it in the longer context of not just Mormon fundamentalism, but the ethics of covering groups like Mormon fundamentalists. So let's get to the interview. Thanks again to Dr. Galliano for spending some time and lending her expertise to this important, sobering, and revealing topic. A few concluding thoughts on the documentary. I remain fundamentally torn on the documentary for a number of reasons. On the one hand, it's an important story that needs to be told, as chilling and disturbing as it is. Two, Christine Cottis's methods in the end worked. Samuel Bateman is a monster, had to go to jail, and what they did to get him in jail is in the end vindicated because, again, he's in jail. But at the same time, I'm also worried about the precedent that this sets, as well as a perpetuation of a type of approach. So I think I want to make a key distinction here. On the one hand, there are the methods that were used to gather this material and in the end indict and imprison Samuel Bateman. I think all of that is 100% vindicated, right? That the Katas, Christine, and Tolga should be greatly commended for what they did, because they did a lot of good in putting that man behind jail. The second issue is, after he's in jail and after they've compiled all that material, what are the ethics in then telling that story? And in the end, I'm just not as comfortable with still framing this story around outsiders going in and doing the saving. I wish the story were framed around people like Julia, one of the older mothers who kind of has this awakening moment and works with Christine, or even with someone like Noms, one of the younger wives who, when she appears on screen, eventually in modern clothes, recognizing the change that she had gone through, was truly striking. So But again, those are critiques that people with, valid opinions can be on either side. Because in the end, this documentary series works as a storytelling mechanism. It was very compelling. There are several moments in this series that even though I knew the history, I was on the edge of my seat. And most importantly, it did the most important thing, which is landing Bateman in jail and allowing the stories of people like Julia and Noms to be better known. All right, I am now very grateful to be joined by one of the top scholars on this topic. And in fact, when I saw this documentary was coming out, I immediately knew I wanted to talk to Dr. Christina Galliano. So Dr. Galliano, let's start out with this story deals with humans, and we need to keep the ethics of especially covering minors and these people who are living these lives not for our entertainment, even though it ends up being part of our Netflix screen. So keeping all that in mind, how did you feel this series handled everyone involved, most notably the children?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm grateful for it, especially in the world of documentary, ethnography, anything dealing with human beings. These are real people. They're real people with real lives. And I want to make it clear that Sam Bateman should be in jail, fully. Anyone implicated in the abuse of the victim should be in jail. And the extent to which filming the content helped with that, I think that should be commended, because it certainly did. But I do have two main concerns around it. The first was the use of AI. Instead of blurring faces, the documentary makers chose to redigitize the faces, and there have been numerous concerns raised that the faces were not altered enough, even for minors, that they are recognizable. And this is a concern because minors are unable to consent to anything, and that includes having their sexual exploitation aired to the world. So the faces should have been blurred. And I would also say this about their homes. The raid is very different than Yearning for Zion. Yearning for Zion in Texas, that property was confiscated. It was seized by the government. This is a place where people still live, including people in the documentary. So having their actual homes with their faces, that can lead to problems. It can lead to more abuse. It can lead to re-traumatization. And so I'm concerned about that. The raid itself being filmed, I mean, we can all imagine, one of the most traumatic moments of your life being shaky cam filmed. I think there's some ethical concerns about that. But the other one is compensation is always a question with media. Documentary is not lucrative. You're not bringing in the big bucks doing documentary. And so were children compensated for having their exploitation filmed? I don't know the answer to that. I know there's a lot of GoFundMe's going around for them, but I think it's worth thinking about at least.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you bringing that up. That was the dynamic that I had in my mind. And one of these, I don't want to give too many spoilers for those who haven't watched it yet, but there's a very compelling moment that includes Noms and when they're trying to track one of the young plural wives, track her down. And on the one hand, I'm like on the edge of my seat. And on the other, I'm like, this is probably one of the most traumatic moments in this person's life. And what does it mean that I'm titillated by watching this? And yeah, so I'm really glad you brought that up. So now that we've discussed the ethics, let's put on our scholar's hat. And you're one of the great historians of this movement. Now, some people will watch this series and they'll be like, this is a small community of just a few families. So in other words, it's of course important because it's a human story, but on the other, what's the actual relevance here? Now, you have studied the broader fundamentalist movement. So from your perspective, what's the use in zeroing in on these admittedly very limited and parochial groups in order to understand these broader lessons?
Yeah, I mean, I would start by saying, for perspective, I'm part of a religion with over 1 billion members. I think the LDS Church is tiny. So, I mean, right, for perspective, I think the LDS Church is small. Mormon fundamentalism is even smaller. I mean, Mormon fundamentalism is not even a fraction of that. And yet I chose to spend a good portion of my life studying it. And I can honestly say that I have learned more about the nature of religious authority, of gender and religion, of legislation, kinship, many things, canning, just by studying these particular small religious communities. The reality is that family history, localized history is history. And whether people like it or not, this is the history of Utah. This is the history of Mormonism. Mormon history and Utah history includes the parts that are difficult, the parts you don't like, and the parts that seem irrelevant, but actually really shape the broader story of this place and this faith. And so the story of the women who lived under Sam Bateman is the culmination of countless choices throughout history. And knowing this story and knowing the outcome of this story ultimately helps us evaluate what those choices were and the trajectory that led to this moment. I don't think we can really think of the entire history of the prosecution of polygamy in Utah without at least thinking about this story as well.
Yeah, and one of the choices that these stories help to contextualize that may be very difficult for lots of viewers is why people would choose to follow Sam Bateman. And I'm sure you've had this in dealing with just Mormonism in general. Why would someone follow Joseph Smith? Why would someone follow Brigham Young? And that's a tough enough answer to provide for people outside the Mormon community. It seems even more impossible when dealing with someone like Sam Bateman, who you're watching on TV and you see his clear flaws. You see his clear limits, setting aside his criminal, predatory nature. So knowing your background of how this type of authority works in these communities, what would lead to Sam Bateman being able to have this albeit brief, but rise to power?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've obviously never been a member of this community, but I do hope I can offer some insight, because the reality is that people who follow religions that are small, that are led by charismatic leaders or non-charismatic leaders, these people aren't dumb. Like, these people aren't just making a series of stupid choices. Now, granted, many of them are minors, and so that adds a layer, but one of the women, there's kind of, I think, two factors that came together with the rise of Sam Bateman. One of the women mentions the reality that after Warren Jeffs went to prison, marriages were over. This is because the one man who was authorized to perform those marriages, to authorize those marriages, to allow those sealings is gone. Women in this community were taught from the time they were little that to be a daughter in Zion meant to be placed beside a priesthood holder, married. Without this, your identity as a woman is gone. Your theological significance is diminished. You're not going to heaven. That's scary. Compound this with the highly insular culture where there isn't choice. This isn't a situation where there's not much choice. It's a situation where there is not choice. So suddenly, with all this in mind, you see a man and a woman and a baby. And the deep longing that you might have had from childhood, or the significance of that theologically, might come together, and you see your path of salvation in front of you. And that is very compelling. Now, add to this, Warren is in prison, and there is a power vacuum that is very real in the community. This is not like when Thomas Monson died, and there was a senior member of the 12 waiting in the wings, and everyone knew who it was going to be. This is a massive shift, especially because it's unexpected. He's in prison in Texas. All of a sudden, a man, the same man who can promise you marriage, albeit to him, and children, albeit from him, is saying that he's acting as something akin to Warren's mouthpiece. And for outsiders, that seems odd, but there's precedent to this, because Warren Jeffs did the same thing. Warren's dad, Rulon, had a stroke, and he died in 2002, leaving behind 65 wives. And there's a lot to be said about that, most of which being that Warren had kind of orchestrated the accumulation of women. But prior to his death, Warren had started to tell people that Rulon would, quote, be renewed. There's even a song for he shall be renewed. He shall run and leap for Zion streets of gold. His body will then be renewed, restored to in his youth. The problem is that didn't happen. Rulon died. And in the midst of the power vacuum, Warren stood before the community and he claimed that Rulon had actually been renewed. he had been renewed in Warren, and now Warren was the prophet of God. So Sam knew the playbook of this. He was raised in this community. He knew the playbook. He followed the path that was familiar, and he spoke to an emotional gap that people were experiencing in pain, sorrow, loss, confusion. The charisma is secondary, and he was able to become the guy.
Yeah, that's so importantly put, that the same values that outside the community we might place on what we expect leaders just function fundamentally different in
Yes.
this movement. And the fact that charisma is secondary, I think that captures that idea quite well. Another choice that will be difficult for a lot of people outside the community to understand is, why didn't these people go to the cops, especially those like Julia, when they start recognizing that there are problems? Why can't they go to the authorities? But there's a deep history there. Why does that history tell us why that choice just wasn't even an option in their mind?
Yeah, and again, this is very hard because most people are trained from the time they're little. If something happens, there are people in authority that can help you. But since the 1930s, Mormon fundamentalists knew that they were ardently disliked. In fact, Short Creek was founded as a, quote, refuge of the saints, to get away from both the government and the LDS Church, who often worked together to oust polygamists. This became most kind of salient and visible in 1935 when Elma Bollinger, who was the Mojave County attorney, he actually commented to the news that the LDS Church was helping to arrest the polygamists. This was largely because polygamy was embarrassing. I mean, this is something you've written about with Heber J. Grant, with J. Reuben Clark. Polygamy is an embarrassment, even though they were Heber J. Grant was a polygamist. But anyway, but then in 1944, a raid happened, and people were taken from their homes. And then in 1953, the raid happens. 153 out of the 263 children in the town were taken. And I want to really emphasize that this includes children of monogamous people. The cited crime was polygamy, but children of monogamous families were taken. During that raid, 36 men went to jail. And people forget about this part. Women went to jail too. Granted, there was only 8 of them, but this is still 8 women in jail for polygamy. The reason is that polygamy was a felony regardless of your gender. And so people often imagine only bad men go to jail for polygamy, but that is not the case. We have pictures of women sitting in their cells. One of the most well-known women who lost her children later was a woman named Vera Black. She died in 2020 at the age of 102. But she lost her children not for polygamy. She lost her children because she refused to teach them polygamy was wrong. So that was the whole thing. Men like Warren Jeffs knew this. We have audio recordings of Warren telling children to close their eyes and imagine losing their mothers. We have audio of him saying, "We are the next Waco." Now, if you believe he's a prophet and he has told you we're the next Waco, the 2008 raid on the Yearning for Zion Ranch would have been a fulfillment of prophecy. And so in the series, when the FBI arrives, the women use the language of raid. It is something that is deeply part of the communal memory of these people. Top this all off, there's a constant barrage of information about how scary the outside world is, how dangerous, how they hate you. And I also want to add the fact that when police and government do get involved, they actually don't care much of the time. We saw this in the series, that the crimes were reported, and one of the cops even said, "This is really hard for a tender-hearted guy." I don't remember how he worded it. So we have the weaponization of fear that created an environment where people knew they were hated. And then to top it all off, there's a long history of realization that when you do report it, no one cares.
Right. Yeah, I think, and especially for those who are coming from an LDS background, think about how much the community talks about the Hans Mill massacre. And the Hans Mill massacre, if you were to look at the proportion of people compared to the proportion of people of the FLDS community that was swept up in the raid, is actually quite smaller. And yet that still looms so large in the LDS memory, despite it, happening decades ago. So you can understand how this martyrdom complex, persecution complex comes to shape that community. And the dynamic is the same, even if the community is different. And one other dynamic that I know lots of people are always fascinated with, it's why, these fundamentalist exposés are often so popular in the media, is underage marriages. So, as a historian of the fundamentalist movement, why has this become such a touchstone issue, both within the community as well as just the broader cultural fascination with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the broader cultural fascination, people like spectacle. It's why people slow down when there's a car accident. I mean, people are just really committed to watching spectacle happen. The history of it, though, is actually the history of underage marriage is really based on the history of placement marriage in the community, of the prophet choosing who you are going to marry. And this is actually, that is something not rooted in a long history. This is something that really emerges in the 1940s. For those interested, one of my favorite articles ever written on Mormon fundamentalism is a history of placement marriage, written by Marianne Watson. And she writes about how this emerges in the 1940s, really based on the diaries of her grandfather, Joseph Lyman Jessup. And he's really kind of a famous figure in the community. But he tells this story because he opposed the very first placement marriage in the community. And it was the secret marriage of his daughter, Christine, when she was 15 years old, at the hands of John Y. Barlow. This marriage causes a major rift in the community between Barlow and Joseph Musser, who ends up going off and founding what becomes the Apostolic United Brethren. The big reason he was opposed to it was it goes against free agency. Young people can't exactly make choices. He also really cared about father's spiritual authority in the home, and they went around him. Anyway, this causes a rift. But once placement marriages begin, this becomes a hallmark of the community. The one man selects and seals families. One man rule, which was really kind of established under John Y. Barlow, asserts that the spiritual and temporal authority of the community is bound to him. So he decides families, also like finance, housing. Now you compound this with the early fundamentalist theology of wives in heaven and polygamy for exaltation. Early leaders in the fundamentalist community often talked about 357 being the number of wives you need for the degrees of glory in heaven. It rhymes. But as time goes on, men marry more and more women. I mentioned Rula and Jeffs having 65 wives. And this becomes a sign of their authority and their power in the community, the accumulation of women. Birth rates, despite this, never change. Men and women are still born the same rate. And so the accumulation of wives and the formulation of theological justification required more women, and more women simply did not exist, especially now that FLDS doesn't take converts. It's very hard to convert to these communities. They also just don't get a lot of converts. And so this created a culture where marrying younger and younger women became increasingly common. In some cases, incest becomes part and parcel of the system. And theological justifications were created mostly after the fact. But whatever those justifications were, the reality is that in the midst of this constant accumulation of more and more women, many underage girls end up being irreversibly damaged. Young men also often get removed from their community, and the harm is immense.
Yeah, and I think back to how there is some precedent for this in the LDS community, going back to the Mormon Reformation in 1856. I remember Wilford Woodruff writing a letter about going to the southern Utah communities where they're, very much wanting to follow the priesthood instruction to get married, but due to the very same demographic issues you highlight, that meant marrying younger and younger wives. And Wilford Woodruff, an apostle, was like, I'm not sure this is a great idea, guys. There are some consequences here. So again, there is some broader Mormon context for this that is not as distant as maybe some would think.
And I will say, as much as maybe LDS listeners might not like hearing it, the reality is that women like Fanny Alger have been used as theological justification.
Yeah, I think that's right. So one of the other things with this cultural fascination with Mormon fundamentalism is so much of these depictions end up following a common trope, a narrative that you can find similar across all the different documentaries and books and exposés of how the villains act, the external heroes that come in and save them, and then the eventual liberation. as someone who actually knows the deep history across all these different groups, I'm sure you often get tired of how they often get reduced to these tropes. So what do you wish these casual watchers of the Netflix and Hulu documentaries and readers of these books, what do you wish they knew about the fundamentalist community that doesn't often get captured in these media depictions?
Yeah. I mean, before I answer this, I do want to just note that there is harm in these communities. I do not want to diminish that by anything I say after that. But to answer, I mean, the big thing I always say is not all fundamentalists are FLDS. All FLDS are Mormon fundamentalists, but not all Mormon fundamentalists are FLDS. There is more to Mormon fundamentalism than polygamy. Mormon fundamentalists are not just LDS people with more wives and more moms. They have an entirely different historical and theological formation. They're very different communities. Most Mormon fundamentalists are monogamous. The reason for that is the numbers, again, don't add up. And so that's kind of a reality, is that most people who have this belief system are not actively practicing polygamy. I would probably also say that independent Mormon fundamentalism is a growing reality. Many people, I would actually say most people who practice polygamy, who are part of the Mormon fundamentalist movement, are not necessarily directly tied to one specific group or have a particular prophet. Authority vacuums, power struggles, underage marriage, placement marriage, all of that are not just concerns to outsiders. There are many fundamentalist Mormons who are also worried about this and who are increasingly interested in living polygamy, living Mormon fundamentalism outside of groups that are kind of particular. And then I would also say, lastly, that yes, there's deep harm in these communities. Again, I never want to diminish that. But there's also people who are good in the Mormon fundamentalist community. I always use this example that when I think of Mormon fundamentalism, I think of a family who, in 2021, my dog Maggie got cancer. And it was really hard. And a friend of mine is a pharmacist and he's a rancher. And I reached out to him and he compounded chemotherapy for my dog. And it didn't save her life, but it did make her life more comfortable. And he has 2 wives. And he's someone who I'm grateful to know. Their family are people I'm grateful to know. They're always very quick to discuss the harm. They're always very quick to want to discuss the pervasive problem of child marriage. And so I think that's an important thing to realize too. I don't like polygamy. I never have. But it is the case that there are those exceptions. Faith is very complicated. People who hold these faiths are complicated people. They're real people. And true crime is probably never going to show you that.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end this interview on. Dr. Galeano, thank you again for sharing your expertise.
Thanks so much.
So just as a reminder, this is just the first part of my video series on this topic. Next Wednesday, I will be doing an interview with Shirley Draper, a member from the community who can give the perspective from those who are living in those trenches of their reactions both to this documentary in which Shirley Draper appeared, as well as the broader history of cultural fascinations with Mormon fundamentalists and what lessons we really should be learning. I want to conclude this video, however, by saying that I understand why so much attention is given to Mormon fundamentalism in general, and these extreme versions of fundamentalism in particular. But simultaneously, I also mourn in how this constant perpetual fascination with these types of stories give a distorted look of Mormon fundamentalism in general and Mormonism in particular, the broader movement, that I worry that and this is a broader issue, right? That our true crime fascination highlights the exceptional, which makes a much more partisan, polarized world of which Mormon fundamentalism is just yet another pawn. So we are understanding these groups for these external purposes rather than on their own terms. But again, that's a difficult topic that requires a lot more conversation. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others so we can broaden the conversation. Subscribe to the channel if you like this content, and become a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why this wrestling with historical communities gives so much context to what's going on today, especially in these radical and disturbing stories.